A very good afternoon, everyone. The Sigi topic sina equity last blog oituniko equity BEGC 107 British Poetry and Drama 17th and 18th centuries. Akoi hogre ko akoi blog ahum cover tolore last blog inolution gibuto Dryden diniko adum sigi na anova poet ama lokalaga magi hetare study ko unit mari yawgani asina first unit magi introduction habitare ko Block number 4 jina Alexander Pope The Rape of the Lock haise ko si yamna maming chutpa yamna haitare often quote to bahar jare as well as yam toina pino satire amagi example piba kanda one of the greatest have we are ko satires ni ma se aduga sigi satirist have jare ko the Pope the Rape of the Lock sina akhoi yam important oiba piece of English literary satire or mock epic poem na have to have yari ko. On sigi topics ni equina na nagadori ko in the next today's ang sigi ka amasung next 3 classes sa have ko unit summary yaw na. So the equina the Rape of the Lock se direct the holding the Rape of the Lock iramiba kuigi Alexander Pope se karamakan gi writer no ko magi life magi biography ko magi writing style, magi themes, magi approach, simyam the queen in the bahan the kata. Auna the Sigi unit 1 zida the age of Alexander Pope, ko magi matam mana magi influences have tare ko aduga Dryden ki influence mo no ko pradu mo me amma queen ang Sigi lecture zida have tare ko sin nagani aduga mathangi class gi akoina the Rape of the Lock se koi directly du hoya see the Rape of the Lock se introduction oina ko habedi maming gi oina kitang budi palamge adubu ngasi gi lecture sida the Rape of the Lock se koi direct hokte hoki ro ko ngasi gi sida di akoina Alexander Pope ai ba the man behind the poem habi tare behind the mock epic habi are ko aduga akoina ngasi analyze toro ko magi writing style ka adugu mo akoina learn to ne aims and objectives. Our aim through this unit is to give a brief history of English literature till the 18th century. At the end of your study of this unit, you will be able to see how the ethos of the age was reflected in the poetry of the period. Zeitgeist type matamdugi political, social, literary, sugumba changes have a tie natraga innovations hagadra natraga movement hagadra du myam do kuigi matamgi poets singna mogi works in the kamaina portrait awi kamaina udli ko kamaina with the khangali ko have do adugi matang do ne ko sigi 17th and 18th centuries have a tie na ko kuigi British poetry and drama have a tie ko ne do reason aduga identify characteristics of English poetry of early 18th century Augustan age aduga last key aim sina have that natural objective sina English poetry ki characteristics have the kari magun cheli ko karam kamaini kari themes kari style season ko rhyming scheme boiro iambic pentameter Shakespeare ni malung irambai mong the ibra itabra adu myam ko ni dori ne ko aduga 18th century English poetry ki age se maming mayam yawi ko the age of popes by or the neoclassical to have heard Jawi aduga sidana kuna Augustan age and ko wiki Augustus 7 to the lower record Augustan age and ko ona sigi mayam je sigi aims mayam je kuna ngasi nainaraga clear understanding of ko program kan dunya introduction a brief introduction to history of English literature till 18th century which had the distinction of the emergence of John Dryden and Alexander Pope aduna brief introduction of English literature ko matam the 18th century the Dryden amasung Alexander Pope with the kahitara emerged the way habito adugi matang pinaga pato niya ko Dryden died at turn of century he and Pope are considered to be poets belonging to the Augustan age and they are among the greatest satirical poets of England ona Dryden na budi hale lagi da ba aduga Pope Kamaga je mapani ma Augustine VIII the belong to we na pre historian sing of the literary critics in the logical aduga mapani je ki English satirical or English satire hierarchical English satire panbakanda English satire have the study to bakanda anizina two of the greatest have tare pa England gi England gi tulak pa why the satire ibahibda Dryden ka Pope je ani je kuna example moina or epitome have tare pa lobby period in which Dryden wrote called Restoration Age, though he is clubbed with Pope as an Augustine Pope. Dryden iramba tangkak hagadra matamdo we restoration to high restoration of the monarchy kay kalpa dumyando mamang da we lecture du geography ko adubu maze Augustine Pope ni na zulawe Dryden sa habadi product se maze matam ani gi product habata ko restoration period to jumayawi magi matam restoration period ni aduga Pope ka maga fullaga Augustine is jumaze Augustine is ki Pope ni zulawe Dryden received classical education and was a graduate from Trinity College. So now Trinity College, so we Isaac Newton hoina tamak pa yamna important away yamna kahta history yam chang mali ko college or the tamaga graduate of them. But Pope had no formal classical education and he was a self-educated person. Now animak sina we English satire da animaki role yamna aduki matik chawre mawani na English satire ki growth da chawu thubang ama lawi have say historian art critics called the researchers called the students in the way na accept to ko adubu mabani ki journey have tare ne ko mabani ki lambi se aduki mati khenai Dryden di classically trained ni classical education am pangi batam classical education ha the Greek Roman Latin ko adu ma language da tam ko ancient adu yang tam pangi aduga ma masamak Trinity College gi graduate torpani adubu Pope ti adugumba classical education ju phangide aduga ma masamak su mana self educated da masana masa takcharaga maze education do masana self educated in to ko aduna so CNE se pina mabani mag yam important oi we restoration as well as we as of Pope natraga Augustine is hari ko Augustine is ni makiro diplomatic chawi satire English satire gi growth ta ani mag se diplomatic chawi tudang lormi adubu mabani ki career have tare ko magi hor ko je lambi do yam kene have tare ko Dryden na college tamakpa education formal education do hire ko formal education ka pangi Alexander Pope na masana mazaraga masana takcharaga hairakpa amasung magi talento sum mangkalakpa point amani na nalong tare next laksiko introduction. Despite vastly different backgrounds, both celebrated poets who embellished poetic genius with critical insight during England's Restoration and Augustine period. They wrote about effective qualities of a critic in their prose essays. So now, mabani ki background je yamna kenaragazu yamna kenaba document kenaba idu ereko. Animak se mabani ki quality animak se pina appreciate to music ko. Ai matam du to wi music to ko. Dryden ga Pope ki poetic genius habitare adudu apina deny to yati gandai ko aduki matik talented oiba aduki matik kaitare naturally gifted oiba point na to way they wrote about effective qualities of a critic in their prose essays now effective qualities of a critic amagi effective qualities kari kari se gada ko 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 no habi batang du ko amasung Dryden irami ko adu mabani je critic ki role ju play torme habitare ko mo prose essays da hoi mabani ma satire amadi poems kumba ibadana hena mamin chalaga ju mogi prose essays myam ju lei yam important eba yam na quality lei ha tare matuni ko Pope wrote that effective qualities are needed not only in a critic but also in author and reader. While our focus in this blog is on Alexander Pope and poetry written in the first half of the 18th century, we will briefly present history of English literature leading up to 18th centuries to facilitate understanding of Augustine poetry, of which Alexander Pope was the exemplar. Auna, akoina masigi lectures da ko masigi units da akoina Pope ki matang da or the first half of the 18th century ki matang di iramba worksing have ta Augustine 8 sa ga ko adi matang di to nei na bagi uina semba kahta the chapter intro unit or ga ju ko akoina 18th century for the English literature English poetry have ta ko kamaina evolve to ahong kamaina laki khoti habdo hana nainaba ma change ko adu nainara ba tungda o hana sumaina lerami ko hana sumaina poetry have say religious yamna orami ko spiritual orami adu ma evolve tore matam na porakpa ahong bagi matungin na ko haidi poetry wero prose wero writing style writing skills habda ko mayam ma evolve tore ko na kuina mam past tu yenga kanda present se kun understand to ko ngam ni ko mamang na sumaina torami ko sumaina lerami ko ꯍꯧꯖꯤꯛꯅ ꯁꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯁꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯇꯧꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯁꯤꯒꯤ ꯌꯨꯅꯤꯠꯁꯤꯗ ꯌꯦꯡꯉꯒ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯃꯥꯡꯗ ꯀꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯃꯤ ꯄꯣꯛꯄꯒꯤ ꯃꯃꯥꯡꯗ ꯗ꯭ꯔꯥꯏꯗꯟꯒꯤ ꯃꯃꯥꯡꯗ ꯑꯗꯨꯒ ꯄꯣꯛꯀ ꯗ꯭ꯔꯥꯏꯗꯟꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯅ ꯀꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯑꯍꯣꯡꯕ ꯀꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯂꯩ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯉꯁꯤꯒꯤ ꯌꯨꯅꯤꯠꯁꯤꯗ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯅꯩꯅꯔꯒ ꯑꯟꯗꯔꯁꯇꯦꯟ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯉꯝꯒꯗꯣꯏꯅꯦ ꯃꯊꯪꯒꯤ ꯌꯨꯅꯤꯠꯇ ꯂꯥꯛꯁꯤꯀꯣ History of English literature up to the 18th century. First period known as Anglo-Saxon age. In the context of language and literature written in this period, we refer to it as Old English. On ihan hanbada akhoi Anglo-Saxon ko akhoi masi matamdaga akhoi biol ka habda ko masigi English sidi akhoi hojik matamgi English ka atuki matik khenare haibadi akhoi je time travel gum to bunga mekal ko aduga Anglo-Saxon age sa halagadi moina ngangi balon moina di English ni ko moina ngangi du English ni akhoi nu ngangi English du English ni ko modern English haibda tare si ni je pau sumphau khongda bunga maroi haibadi language se or English have language se yamna aduki matik evolve to bani na ba ahong me por na ahan ba period da we French Norman sing ka haidare ko William the Conqueror when the laga when the ngam balon ko have a mix of this and that haidare ko English laga ngang pe language to Anglo-Saxon English ko ko na traga atopa ming man haraga Old English and lower ko aduga second period na kaino second period known as the Middle English period or the medieval age and the language and literature of this period is referred to as Middle English. Now, sidana akwai medieval English language na Chaucer gumba ko, Geoffrey Chaucer, kaya Canterbury Tales even pa ko. Aduga matumo mayamu na mo matam di English ko, sina Middle English kawi, ang traga atopa mingna medieval English kawi. Siju akwai hujiki English ka yam na kenare spelling buoro pronunciation buoro kenare ko. Adugo all English na traga Anglo-Saxon English ki matam ka Middle English ki yingam kan ti mo modern English te hena managar tu je Middle English ki English ni ko aduna language English se phase ahum thongna chawrangna haiba tare ko phase ahum thongna natraga stages ahum thong khai dui Anglo-Saxon age natraga Old English age habam ne Middle English age ko natraga medieval age habam ne aduga aroibada je open sinariba third known as modern English which is ngangi ko We are familiar with the language of modern period as spoken and written language is closer and reasonably similar to what we use today, but this cannot be said of Old English and Middle English. The archaic and outmoded style or use of language and syntax are difficult to comprehend. Oh no, modern English ki period the season of English sinjidi when understand the bunga me yam manare I believe more or less. Adubu Old English natraga medieval natraga Middle English ki language natraga Middle English ki English to have tare ko. aduga hujik matam ba modern English ki na pakan dukki mati kenare archaic wore habidi matam amagi quality ma chele understand to the warani pa the warani communicate to the almost next to impossible or any have tare habidi word se yam evoke tore the pronunciation yam evoke tore all English gi na natraga Anglo-Saxon English gi modern English gi matam ko auna adukki mati kenaba leirabani na equina masigi se kai tare phases on to na khaidui First period, known as Anglo-Saxon age. In the context of language and literature written in this period, we refer to it as Old English. Second period, known as the Middle English period or the medieval age, and the language and literature of this period is referred to as Middle English. The Middle English Third, known as modern period, we are familiar with the language of modern period as spoken and written language is closer and reasonably similar to what we use today, but this cannot be said of Old English and Middle English. The archaic and almost use of language and syntax are difficult to comprehend. Now, Anglo-Saxon the Middle English the medieval English modern period English or modern language now Old English ka Middle English ka modern the yam nikene adum simi am ko khangom dala I think it's like that. ꯑꯍꯥꯟꯕꯗ all English ꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ all English ꯁꯦ all English literature consists of sermons and saints' lives, biblical translations, translated Latin works of the early church fathers, Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and narrative history works, laws, wills, and other legal and practical works on grammar, medicine, geography, and poetry. Now, all English literature the kari na sage, haibadi matam da kari matang iramge written ko, ay survive the whole ko, kama kari gi wari organa kari wari ko, or the official document ki mong ke iba have kan da sermon sar ka di religious teachings mo kay mam le ko, the sense lives sensing kunchi matang di biblical translations are Latin works to the early church of the early church father on the Latin word gi order to the Latin the iramba wiki biblical works me ando all in English translate to ko adu sitemi Anglo-Saxon chronicles chronicle matam gi ningthau gi period mana palami matam gi ko ma record to ho ko ko ma se ko my history have ta na ko and narrative history works history matang di iramba law in matang da ko haibadi yai ya te chumi lali ko or the will side na ko gi ꯑꯩꯒꯤ ꯂꯟ ꯊꯨꯝ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯤ ꯑꯃꯗ ꯅꯠꯇ꯭ꯔꯒ ꯑꯩꯒꯤ ꯑꯦꯌꯔꯗ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯃꯉꯣꯟꯗ ꯁꯤꯟꯅꯔꯝꯕ ꯈꯣꯠꯂꯝꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯥꯡꯒꯤꯕ ꯗꯣꯀꯨꯃꯦꯟꯗꯨꯕꯨ ꯋꯤꯜꯁ ꯀꯧꯏꯀꯣ and other legal works ꯃꯌꯥꯝ ꯑꯃ ꯌꯥꯎꯏ and practical works ꯌꯥꯎꯏ on grammarda ꯑꯣꯏꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯒ꯭ꯔꯥꯃꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯔꯒꯗꯤ ꯔꯨꯜꯁꯇꯨꯅꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯂꯦꯡꯒ꯭ꯋꯦꯖ ꯑꯃꯕꯨ ꯒꯣꯕꯔꯟ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯔꯨꯜꯁꯕꯨ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯒ꯭ꯔꯥꯃꯔ ꯀꯧꯏꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯩꯗꯤ medicine geography and poetry medicine gi matang ju ibo thinai geography matang thinai amasung poetry matang ju ko dum thinai all English ki matang matam na iram bata hai bata most notable among these is the Anglo-Saxon chronicle a historical record. This chronicle was begun about the time of King Alfred's reign, King Alfred ki matam da 871 to 899 and continued for more than 3 centuries chahum ai tar ko hena century mai chai chama ko all English poetry had for its content heroic actions and codes of conduct and Christian ideals, and it employed various figures of speech to enhance the diction. Diction the work of poetry poems choice of words so adu bokina diction kari ko aduna all English poetry is kari matang no have kind heroic actions ko night kumba kai managa moinaga common people ga protect over na tra odagidi yamna popular the trope ma the damsel in distress ka have to ko pise yamna virtuous oiba brave oiba knight amanaga safe to biba ko and then romanticize to ko pa the codes of conduct sin matang yaure the Christian ideals haragadi koi gi Christian gi Christian ama as a good Christian amana kai to toi kai to thokte khote happen na ram da dugi rules kumba haida tra pa du ma chana bi ideals me do matang gi thing nei atuga figure of speech me ama thing nei ko matang du da atuga kaigino da pa ba kan da ken interesting oina ba magi diction choice to yam na ko pa mo aina ko na ba auna sigi chronicles ko Anglo-Saxon chronicle mamangi slide yaw ki buto King Alfred ko 871 tagina 899 matam tagi ho gibani aduga chahi chahum hen na makata chathagi chronicle do matang ko ningto ma dagi ningto ma du dagi mu ningto to ma ko mai cha ma su na tra auna King Alfred ki matam dagi horaga almost 300 years or more than 300 years I have 3 centuries and sathagi adugi record to all English ki one of the earliest have chronicles in the logi so on the all English ki works in the sermons and saints lives biblical translations translated Latin works of the early church fathers called Anglo-Saxon chronicles and narrative history works laws wills, and other legal and practical works on grammar, medicine, geography, and poetry. On top of the all English, the Irambasing the Yam practical over Yam useful over have a type of the Tamu on grammar, medicine, geography, the on the all English key, but literature have a type and the Mayam say Yam spiritual way, Bible the Yam the best of it, church the Yam the best of it. Aduga ningthogi punchi record of ko padu gisu yakun yawti mathang is cycle wasi Middle English. The Norman conquest of the 10th century, 11th century, 1066 AD, started Middle English period. The French, under the leadership of William the Conqueror, defeated English King Harold. The conquerors brought with them French culture and French language that influenced and enriched the native literature and culture. Oh no, Middle English but the Norman conquest have a Normandy the Gilako, France the Gilakumiana, England the conquered over 1066 ago. William the Conqueror has means the Yaureko, Mana defeatawi, England Unito, King Harold defeataraga, Maje France the Gilak Ninaba. Magi conquerors in the Muniki for a cab kind of French culture, Chinja tradition, culture, me pori, or the Hindukana, French language supported, or Nadugi Londuna Madugi Lon Dugi impact say, Hoymatandugi, Anna Leramiba, all English have the impact of Ure, Aduga evolution, evoke of on Hana, Nangamba Lon, Nangamba Haitara. Sinaramba words for grammar for Mayam, Sifamala, Aduga French words in Mayama introduced or everyday parlance stuff, everyday conversation habitat. William the Conqueror, 1066, I the 11th century, the King Harold would defeat the Rogalakugiti, French culture Porapa, French language Porapa, Maduna Ahum Bamazu, English people, English language, I have that also walking Bama, on the Gore. Theocentric view of world. Theocentric had the issue the line center of the world in the and place God at center of the universe. And the universe may have the God lay in the Writers of medieval age used themes related to religion, chivalrous deeds, and love. Chaucer, regarded as father of English poetry, best known for Canterbury Tales. The prologue provides lists of 29 people who become pilgrims on a journey to Canterbury, each telling a story along the way. Ahuna, masida Middle English ki literature is na kaida base of have a theocentric oil have the short of kaida focus over aduga gods na university center the lay have a belief to lay aduga movies na mo theme se kari theme have a kanda religion obviously ko yam chaw yaugani chivalrous deeds are the brave for knights kumba knight in shining armor have the body concept later or the love kumamtanga have the romance kumake mata hore. Chaucer, regarded as father of English poetry, and Chaucer belong to the Magi Matunda on a Renaissance English Renaissance from the Shakespeare Lapidin on a Shakespeare Mamang Chaucer na Duga Magi like Canterbury Tales Chaucer Gido or the Buzuko appreciate the The prologue provides list of 29 people who become pilgrims on a journey to Canterbury. It's telling a story along the way. When 29 pilgrims sing habitat and pilgrims the religious journey ama lakpa religion na matam religion na maram moraka mafam amada moina ga laga ki khoiram na ba habitat ko ke physical to lakto or the 29 pilgrims sinjina moina wari ma miraga habitat ko wari the taraka ma the wari to record to Chaucer to howi on the masi is na Canterbury Tales na pina original tales ka the wari collection na ona that is how Middle English na smile to ona the Norman conquest of the 11th century 1066 AD started Middle English period. The French, under the leadership of William the Conqueror, defeated English King Harold Victor. The conquerors brought with them French culture and French language that influenced and enriched the native literature and culture. William or the conquerors in the French language supporting, French culture supporting, aduna the hana le all natraka the kaita all of my dear all ancient hydra all English to adugi change sama evolution nama porokungam theocentric view of world and place God at center of the universe. Writers of medieval age used themes related to religion, chivalrous deeds, and love. Chaucer, regarded as father of English poetry, best known for Canterbury Tales. The prologue provides lists of 29 people who become pilgrims on a journey to Canterbury. It's telling a story along the way. Senior Middle English most important writer Hargadi, Geoffrey Chaucer and that. Modern English. Elizabethan age known as the golden age of English literature. Yes, Elizabeth Queen, Elizabeth Virgin Queen we power writers called dramatists, poets, for example. It could boast of great writers like Shakespeare, or William Shakespeare, Marlowe, Christopher Marlowe, Spencer, Ireland, Edmund Spencer, and Ben Jonson. Poetry and drama reach highest scale both in quality and in number of plays and poems. So now, poetry and drama is na heavy literature is na quite wang level to Elizabethan age because Elizabethan age is a golden age of English literature or na quality to do amasung quantity to do have that na quite productive way ba quite masing ya have that quality as well as quantity animal ko masi se Elizabethan age ki golden age matamda Queen uba phangeb. After Queen Elizabeth, brief period of rule of Oliver Cromwell that displaced monarchy by Commonwealth. During which period there was strict enforcement of morality in all political and social sphere. Ana Elizabeth ki matungda tentak na haiba tare ko brief period ama Oliver Cromwell na Commonwealth to mana kahetare monarchy dubu Commonwealth na replace of haiba de parliamentary system hamna ko. Ana dugi matamda yamna religious or theocentric oibanina akoigi political and social sphere da morality ki matang da yamna chiksalakpanina ko matamda drama ga lomjanba ko we theater gumba kai gumba japin shut down to ko pa atuga lai ki matang na tragedy I baya ta ko ta ba kaina ga yamna lai ko Cromwell wi matamda adu school bu khunge. Cromwell known for making England a republic and led Commonwealth to govern England, followed by Restoration age in last quarter of 17th century, when monarchy was restored with return of King Charles II as King of England. Auna Cromwell jina khang is kai no Cromwell gi role kai na ko kanda England jamana republic we monarchy dagi ko gi parliamentary system government toroga and led Commonwealth to govern England mana England rule to ko. Followed by Restoration age in last quarter of 17th century, when monarchy was restored. Auna monarchy je amu khalaka duine ko habidi Cromwell gi period system sang bi hamta ko with the return of Charles II as King of England. Charles II jina thawina England thawina halakpa kanda di amu Commonwealth tum dissolve toroga habita ne ko parliament tum dissolve toroga absolute monarchy dum halaktuine ko. History of England moves from the 16th to the 18th through the Elizabethan age to the Commonwealth to the Restoration age to the Augustan age through the reigns of Queen Elizabeth I, Charles I, Charles II, and Queen Anne. Sigi period se ko we somehow the Elizabethan age there, golden age there, the Commonwealth age there, we Oliver Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell, or the Restoration age there, number with Charles II, or the Augustan age, Sina Wiki, Kahetara, neoclassical power, we Pope, we give them driving him at the Wiki age, Popina, neoclassical, Wiki Restoration, or sorry, Augustan age in the name. Change of government from Commonwealth to monarchy brought about social transformation. Puritanical morality during regime of Cromwell gave way to licentious and laxity of moral earnestness. Period shows rapid development of science and reason. We notice progressive development from heroic ideals of early period to the theocentric views of medieval period to man-centered works that reflect upon emotions, imagination, and human interest. Our government is Commonwealth monarchy social transformation leader society evolve Cromwell gi makhada yamna puritanical oramba moral yam oramba habidi cia de ko lai ji kar ko yamna restrictive oramba to adugi do amuk laithore control habita ko the monarchy la ko. People saw rapid development of science and reason on the science ka reason ka ki ke hai ta development abu me to no bi phangi osi ki ja gi industrial revolution ka la ko. We notice progressive development from heroic ideals of early period to the theocentric views of medieval period to man-centered works that reflect emotions, imagination, and human interest. Heroic ideals na we early na traga ancient English period ko already theocentric na medieval na traga middle English ki aduga emotions, imagination, and human interest na we modern ki ko theocentric na medieval ki ko theocentric na middle English ki ko aduna we emotions, imagination, and human interest in modern English की basis है बता रहे works in जब तक based हो the 18th century. First half of 18th century, known as Age of Science and Reason, 18th century English literature described as Augustan Age, Age of Enlightenment, Neoclassical Age, Golden Age of Science and Reason, Age of the Novel, etc. Oh, now, first half of 18th century, Age of Science and Reason, industrial age, science reason the base or theocentric or church the sense in the base or was in the 18th century the science and reason the base. 18th century English literature described as Augustan Age, Augustan Age, Age of Enlightenment, Neoclassical Age, Golden Age of Science and Reason, Amasung Age of the Novel. A cursory look at the labels will give us clue that all that was written had at its core the exercise of reason and logic instead of emotion and imagination. Now, masigi titles in that maming solution ko Augustan Age kind of tholiba Golden Age of Science and Reason ko odai Age of Enlightenment kind of maming tholi maram je kari gino niyo ba kandati akhoi atamdugi literature da ko madagi core da exercise of reason and logic. Reason amasung logic da based oraga ire ko emotion and imagination ko yamna idealistic oiba yamna kaitare emotional oiba adugi mahutta reason amasung logic na based owi yamna practical oiba adu loina based owi monta irakpagi sifama pin ubuname. It marked a return to classical age which laid emphasis upon elegance, beauty, order, precision and balance, and hence was known as the Neoclassical Age. It is known as the Augustan Age. The name comes from the Roman Emperor Augustus, who ruled when classical writers like Virgil, Horace, and Ovid were writing. Now, a classical style of writing, the halakpam we emphasis pigi have a elegance, beauty, order, precision, amasum balance. Now, sigi matau have a Augustus have a Roman Emperor Augustus na rule during matamdugi wiki poets sing have a classical writers, for example, Virgil hoy, Horace hoy, Ovid when irambugi style. Madubu mimic doraga, natraga madugi inspiration doraga, wiki ire, see matamgi, wiki poets sing have a na madugi maming the lorga, equina Augustan Age and up into the maming do Augustus the lorga, Augustan Age and so we are 20. On adugido neoclassical neo hargadi new happening on a classical age ogre koroman matunduni on a ogre matumda umhalakpa nina apina mamingse neoclassical in the logo a neo hargan new classical hargan classical matumdi ko ki Virgil hoy Horace hoy of it when important. Next slide class. England adopted mixed monarchy with two political parties fighting elections to rule nation known as Whigs and Tories. The way to reach the electorate was through political pamphleteering, which involved of satire to attack opponent. Literature became a handmaid to politics and was the age of political literature. On the 18th century, the political parties, asobani ko Whigs and Tories, sige driving matang ngang join the panrabani ko. Pinarakulina, moy masen kunaraga. Amana mo kunaraga have tare ko. Have the political power pam nina ko. Only one can be the winner. Whigs na Tories so nina. Moy ki on writers, poets, may Whig support of poet lay, writers lay, Tory support of poet lay, writer lay, on a Matamduda, Mogi intellectual sinarga, Mogi literary intellectual sinarga, group amagi, Niamana group Madukun, Ria Commander Namepa, Madu. Auna, Matamdubuina, age of political literature and its level, because Yamna politicized the Wamo Upangi, ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯂꯤꯇꯔꯦꯆꯔꯗ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯛꯁꯀꯤ ꯏꯟꯐ꯭ꯂꯨꯌꯦꯟꯁ ꯑꯗꯨꯛꯀꯤ ꯃꯇꯤꯛ ꯆꯥꯎꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯤ ꯕꯤꯀꯣꯁ ꯏꯊꯣꯔꯛꯄ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯀꯦꯜ ꯒꯦꯟ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯀꯦꯜꯒꯤ ꯀꯥꯟꯅꯅꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯗꯣ ꯐꯪꯅꯕ ꯍꯣꯠꯅꯔꯛꯄꯅꯤꯅ ꯏꯔꯛꯄ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯁꯥꯏꯁ ꯇꯧꯏ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯀꯦꯜ ꯑꯣꯏ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯄꯣꯂꯤꯇꯤꯛꯁꯀꯤ ꯏꯟꯐ꯭ꯂꯨꯌꯦꯟꯁꯁꯦ ꯌꯥꯝ ꯆꯥꯎꯅ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯦꯕ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ Political debates employed generous amounts of invectives and vitriol, and this contributed to rise of prose and poetic satire. Science, politics, social etiquette, reason, and logic all demanded straightforward prose. Auna, matamdugi ko political debates kumal to ko pata vitriol har kadi kya tabo wang ko ay kunna ko. Auna, poetic satire je masina ju matamdugi political scenario na matamdugi political situation na poetry da habi tayo ko poetic satire da influence of ni have so kuni dalan ngame. Prose became handy vehicle for expression, employed in pamphlets, scientific treatises, political discourses, and codification of social manners and conduct. So, the writers in the pamphlets kumba ibu kopada, scientific treatises ibu da, political discourses ibu kopada, prose am chawna. Sinare have the English literature in mo to the codification and quote in simple kopada social manners kumba conduct kumba the rule gita the simple kopada prose case over topama la kopada pinu 18th century. Aristocratic class educated in Latin and Greek, middle class wanted something that it could understand. This gave rise to periodical essays which were easy to follow. Edison and Steele wanted to bring philosophy out of closets and libraries, colleges and schools, to dwell in clubs and assemblies, at tea tables. The Tatler and the Spectator were journals that were popular in 18th century. Oh no, aristocratic class ko haibadi we nobility have tare paisa pai ko noble ba kugi kata kugi ruling class hai ba moidi Latin amasung Greek the educator ko moidi classical works in the pa ngam e ba dubo middle classes nadi moina understand to ngam ba moina pa ju pa ni na ba awna moina pa ngam do mo da print to ngam e ba awna this gave rise to periodical essays. Periodical haragadi every month, every 2 months, 6 months, every 2 weeks, home essay makandu ko periodical essays ko which were easy to follow. Moise yamna paabdu sulai ko moina pundoi go opinions in the ko English English tira konina paabu sulai re amasu affordable ju oire habitare. On Edison and Steele wanted to kadoni muna quote bring philosophy out of closets and libraries, colleges and schools to dwell in clubs and assemblies at tea tables. Oh no, philosophy gumba ko haibadi yamna intellectual ko kai ko gi suggesting je closets amsung libraries, colleges and schools ko haibani matamgi university gumba college gumba dagi putoraga club amasung assemblies da already coffee house gumba kai gumba da yohan banga hanna ba ina Edison and Steele na moina journal ko ki ba aduna moina pan je moi gi aim je sigi ideas sing je everyday people common people the zoom idea intellectual the Tatler and the Spectator were journals that were popular in the 18th century. In the 18th century the yana popular journal ani the Tatler amasung the Spectator Geneva. The Tatler was started by Richard Steele in 1709. Edison joined Steele and closed the Tatler, and in its place started the Spectator. This is the periodical essays of the two greatest gifts of the 18th century to English literature were the periodical essay and the novel. On the 18th century, the gift and greatest magun say essay style periodical essays in duni. Amasung novel to never novels in 18th century the growth and inception have both genres needed simple, uncomplicated prose. On a genre anima periodical essay boiro, the novel boiro. Yamna aruba wahi wata we poetry gumba ko we satire gumba epic scene ba yamna aruba diction habitat ko metaphor gumba to we essay gumba masung kahita vertical essays amasung novel dadi madu do yaw su yamna simple oiba uncomplicated oiba prose naraga readers in the par can target yare ko this is rise of the English novel. Novel as prose narrative depicting real life began in 18th century. Daniel Defoe considered to be the father of English novel. Oh no, Daniel Defoe is now English novel ki father. Habit mana starting point and low. At age of 59, he wrote his first novel, Robinson Crusoe. Robinson Crusoe is a star of Nicole. Pama shipwreck or mana island number about the mana Friday in the kind of way. I'm not important way. I'm not exciting over power. They are gripping over novel of Nicole. This novel, for the first time, presented realistic description of a desert island where Crusoe was shipwrecked, followed by narration of meeting with native of the land, whom he names Friday, and about his eventual rescue. Ona Robinson Crusoe, hariba novels yana simple in a chapter wise sorga, mana Robinson Crusoe in a shipwreck wherega magi ziki island dugi native ama pottinga mana Friday tole mana amu halapagi warito madu record Robinson Crusoe and torga mana novel in Novel explores man's ability to endure and survive among hostile conditions and ultimately triumph over them. The novel moves through York in England, London, Sal in North Africa, Brazil, then the deserted island of Trinidad, back to England, Lisbon, overland from Spain towards England, and finally the island. On the Sigi journey in Robinson Crusoe, Daniel Defoe record from the York in York, London, North Africa, Brazil, Spain, Portugal, finally island do na sigi journey sigi magi kahitara record habitare ko machine novel published on. Firstly, many innovations in printing technology reduced prices of novels. This led to expansion of reading public. Auna matam amada diko we printing technology ja azna lecturing ida later gazu yamna widespread oina kahitara printing gi web se lacting ida Gutenberg's Bible category Gutenberg's printing press na yam wana print with amasung printed books sing je matamdu the edit point in time have tayo na yam na tangi on na common people sing na poor people na tragus ko middle class people sing na effort to ngamde leige har gus lei ngamde ko auna adubu 18th century the printing technology da ano makan have tayo innovations me am lak padagi di novels ngi price handar ko mure ko price mai maman do kai tayo auna price to handar ni na hana paisa pa be mung na leiba ngam do jiki common people sing flow leiba ngam ko this led to expansion of reading public on reading public na chu ki matam do ko in sing ko penny dreadfuls kind of yan ate people like ko yamna affordable oiba penny ama to piba adu na ko ming penny dreadful guys adu ko malai sing do ki cheap paper da pulp fiction ga have ko yamna ahong ba quality name ba chi da print oraka say all kudingi ko ha kudingi pong ba essays kumba periodicals kumba je praja singna madamgi common people sing have tare ko yamna pa ba hore amasu pa ba sungam ko leibu effort to ngam. Secondly, novels presented a new world that was interesting and relatable. This world, fictitious it may be, was a world that paralleled readers' world and was believable and readers could relate to it. On a new world say readers in this epoch. Some higher, but the challenges me am matang even novel or the reader to go oh sigi protagonist natraga character main character sigi magi challenges sing je ain ju thengai ko magi awa ba je among ju tai ko on relate to ngam me ko on paning be na power ko oh sigi main character ja ai gumba mi amani ko kaina ka ya realistic ko ba portrayal have tare ko matam do we ko na on believable ore readers ku world to a fictional world have the novel to world to ya manahale. For example, Dickens when he remember Charles Dickens when he remember Charles Dickens when he remember quickly Maggie works have that I think Great Expectations spoil Piggy Pepper spoil the David Copperfield adu me do ya relatable ba ya na challenges me matam dugi ko dugi challenges me na me. Thirdly, rise of new middle class seeking new forms of reading contributed to rise of novel. The joy of reading, sharing and discussing novels was a welcome change for this new class. Middle class, new middle class educated oiba aduga disposable income kar leba. Masigi middle class tola banina moi hobby amataga tare. ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯍꯣꯕꯤꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯃꯔꯛꯇ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯦꯐꯣꯔꯗꯦꯕꯜ ꯑꯣꯏꯕꯁꯦ ꯅꯣꯚꯦꯜꯒꯨꯝꯕ ꯄꯥꯕꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯅꯣꯚꯦꯜꯁꯦ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯗꯗꯤꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ ꯂꯥꯏꯔꯤꯛ ꯑꯣꯏꯅ ꯐꯣꯡꯉꯝꯗꯦ ꯆꯦꯞꯇꯔ ꯋꯥꯏꯁ ꯑꯣꯏꯅꯀꯣ ꯑꯦꯕ꯭ꯔꯤ ꯋꯤꯛ ꯈꯨꯗꯤꯡꯒꯤ ꯅꯠꯇ꯭ꯔꯒ ꯑꯦꯕ꯭ꯔꯤ 2 weeks ꯈꯨꯗꯤꯡꯒꯤꯀꯣ ꯔꯥꯏꯇꯔꯗꯨꯅ ꯐꯣꯡꯉꯝꯃꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯒꯤꯅꯤ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤꯀꯣ 18th century ꯀꯣ 19th century ꯅꯣꯚꯦꯂꯤꯁꯁꯤꯡꯁꯦ ꯑꯔꯂꯤ 19th century ꯌꯦꯡꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤꯁꯦ ꯆꯦꯞꯇꯔ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ 30 ꯀꯣ 35 ꯆꯦꯞꯇꯔꯁ ꯀꯣ 30-35 ꯍꯦꯟꯅꯒ ꯆꯦꯞꯇꯔꯁꯤꯡ ꯌꯥꯎ ꯊꯦꯡꯅꯅꯤꯕꯀꯣ ꯃꯗꯨꯒ ꯌꯦꯡꯅꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯅꯣꯚꯦꯂꯤꯁꯁꯤꯡꯅ ꯑꯦꯕ꯭ꯔꯤ ꯋꯤꯛ ꯈꯨꯗꯤꯡꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯐꯣꯡꯅꯕ ꯍꯣꯠꯅꯕꯅꯤꯅ ꯆꯦꯞꯇꯔ ꯌꯥꯝ ꯏꯔꯤꯈꯣꯏ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯄꯩꯁꯥ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯇꯥꯟꯗꯣꯏꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯆꯦꯞꯇꯔꯁꯤ ꯌꯥꯔꯤꯈꯣꯏ ꯁꯥꯡꯗꯣꯛꯅꯕ ꯍꯣꯠꯅꯩꯌꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯋꯥꯔꯤꯁꯤ ꯁꯥꯡꯗꯣꯛꯑꯒꯗꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯄꯩꯁꯥꯁꯤ ꯍꯦꯟꯅ ꯇꯥꯟꯕꯒꯤ ꯆꯥꯟꯁ ꯋꯥꯡꯉꯦ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯃꯁꯤꯒꯤ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯃꯤꯗꯜ ꯀ꯭ꯂꯥꯁ ꯑꯃ ꯊꯣꯛꯂꯛꯄꯗꯒꯤ ꯃꯣꯏꯅ ꯅꯣꯚꯦꯜꯁꯤꯡꯁꯦ ꯄꯥꯔꯒ ꯗꯤꯁꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯕ ꯈꯣꯠꯄ ꯑꯗꯨ ꯃꯣꯏ ꯄꯥꯅꯤꯡꯕ ꯍꯥꯏꯗꯤ ꯑꯅꯧꯕ ꯋꯦꯕ ꯑꯃ ꯂꯥꯛꯑꯦꯕꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯂꯥꯏꯔꯤꯛ ꯄꯥꯅꯤꯡꯕꯒꯤ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦꯅꯦꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯨꯒ ꯐꯣꯔ ꯄ꯭ꯂꯦꯖꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯔꯤꯗꯤꯡ ꯐꯣꯔ ꯄ꯭ꯂꯦꯖꯔ ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯀꯩ ꯍꯥꯏꯇꯥꯔꯦ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯁ꯭ꯀꯨꯜ ꯀꯣꯂꯦꯖꯦꯁꯁꯤꯗ ꯇꯝꯕ ꯄꯥꯕ ꯑꯗꯨꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯅꯠꯇꯕꯀꯣ ꯁꯤꯅ ꯄ꯭ꯂꯦꯖꯔꯒꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ ꯁꯤꯌꯔ ꯇꯧꯅꯤꯡꯕ ꯗꯤꯁꯀꯁ ꯇꯧꯅꯤꯡꯕ ꯃꯌꯥꯝꯁꯨ ꯎꯕ ꯐꯪꯉꯦ Characteristics of Augustan Age. The foregoing history of English literature of the 18th century has been included to illustrate how 18th century poetry had elements of characteristics of novel, periodical essay, satire, prose, and reason. It is clear that ethos of age was fully reflected in prose and poetry of period. On the matamdugi 18th century ki ko ethos ko 18th century ki magi ke tare ke magi qualities che ko ki matamdugi prose and poetry da fazna reflect on. We will find a smooth flow of poetic lines as we find in prose, direct, clear-cut, and forthright. There are no complicated poetic structures, and poetry is written in rhyme couplets. Rhyme couplets are 2 lines of the same length that rhyme and complete one thought. There is no limit to the length of the lines. Oh no, ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ prose ibigi mongda poetic lines is ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ poetry ꯗꯁꯨ ꯎꯕ ꯊꯦꯡꯅꯔꯦꯀꯣ ꯍꯥꯏꯕꯗꯤ ꯀꯃꯥꯏꯅ ꯇꯧꯏ ꯃꯣꯏ qualities ꯍꯥꯏꯕ ꯀꯥꯟꯗ direct ꯑꯣꯏ clear cut ꯑꯣꯏ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ forthright ꯑꯣꯏ ꯑꯗꯨꯅ complicated ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯣꯏꯔꯝꯕ ꯃꯇꯝꯗꯨꯒꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ epic-ꯇꯒ ꯑꯗꯩ ꯃꯃꯥꯡꯗꯒ ꯂꯩꯔꯝꯕ ꯀꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ ꯋꯥꯍꯩ ꯋꯥꯇꯥ ꯑꯔꯨꯕ ꯁꯤꯖꯤꯟꯅꯕ metaphors similes ꯀꯣ ꯑꯗꯩꯗꯤ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯒꯤ figures of speech ꯌꯥꯝꯅ ꯑꯔꯨꯕ ꯁꯤꯖꯤꯟꯅꯕꯗꯣ ꯑꯩꯈꯣꯏꯅ Augustan Age-ꯀꯤ poetry-ꯗꯗꯤ ꯑꯗꯨꯗꯣ ꯎꯔꯔꯣꯏꯕꯀꯣ ꯃꯣꯏꯗꯤ ꯌꯥꯝꯅ direct ꯑꯣꯏꯒꯅꯤ clear cut ꯑꯣꯏꯒꯅꯤ ꯑꯃꯁꯨꯡ forthright ꯑꯣꯏꯒꯅꯤ. Eighteenth century poetry, known as neoclassical poetry. Neoclassical poetry means Kavi. Neo means new, and classical means writing that follows style of ancient Greek and Roman poets. Classical matamdugi Greek amasung Roman poets iramba style du follow toroka irapa mondugu classical poetry ko neoclassical and neoclassical. Neoclassical poetry, a restoration of classicism, which is associated with art of antiquity, harmony, clarity, restraint, universality, and ideal. Ona neoclassical poetry singi magun singcha yamna obvious magun singcha kari kari chen gaba kanda harmony yahodabuni, clarity yahodabuni, restraint yahodabuni, universality yahodabuni, amasung idealistic yahodabuni. The rationalism of poetry, the vehicle of emotion and imagination, while prose, the vehicle of reason and intellect. Poetry is natural and spontaneous overflow of our emotions and imagination, abstract ideas, heightened feelings, and deep emotions that cannot be directly expressed through prose need poetry, which is a free flow of sound, images, and ideas. Anna, prose ka poetry kena bata. Abstract ideas kumba, heightened feelings kumba, deep emotions kumba se prose ki through the fazana akwina express to bungam dam sa poetry ki through the akwina utpangami natraga kangan bungami because we sounds images and ideas ki flows e poetry da hena smooth and sa bungame. Poets prefer logic, reason, sound sense, and judgment as against feelings, sentiments, and emotions. 18th century neoclassical poets viewed reason as mainspring and inspiration for their poetry. This emphasis on reason curtailed spontaneity and rejected fancy and imagination, which form the very source of romantic poetry. 18th century poetry often seemed artificial and manufactured and at times labored. Neoclassicism is distinctly different from Romanticism. If we understand this difference, it will be easy to figure out the characteristics of 18th century poetry. Ona, poets na kari prefer to be logic, reason, sound sense, amasung judgment ni hena paameba. Kari gi nabakanda feelings, sentiments, and emotions ka compare to bakanda. Ona, 18th century neoclassical poetry jina paamise ka inabakanda reason the base to. Mugi poetry ko reason amasung logic, rationalism the base to habitat. Emotions the ideas the feelings the thoughts the natabuka vision logic sense sound sense habitat amasung judgment. Differences between classicism and romanticism means ko classicism stresses on reason and romanticism on imagination and hujikta high crema. Diction in classical poetry is more rigid and measured, unlike in romantic poetry, which prefers simple diction of common people using their everyday idiom. Diction haragadi word choice habitiko. Classical poetry ki word choice di kara rigid oi, habadi kara strict oi habitare ko masi yai masi yate habadi mo ko aduga measured oi. Habadi yamna artificial obagi quality ma chele no urani ko. Aduga romantic ki di yamna natural oi. Everyday language nang ai ko everyone everyday the sinaba loan sinaba words ko sinaba style habitare ko aduga adugi romantic poetry to ubunga me. Classicist emphasis is on form, simplicity, and restrained emotion. 18th century poetry mainly in form of heroic couplets. 18th century poetry is heroic couplets called line ani manava duga rhyme to. A heroic couplet is a rhyming couplet with n rhymes in iambic pentameter. Iambic pentameter Shakespeare when you know. Heroic couplet traditionally appears in long poems called epics, but has been used by Dryden and Pope in mock epics that parody heroic tone of epic poetry. Heroic couplets in the traditionally long narrative poems epics ko busi da yam ubuthing ne adubu Dryden hoi Pope in the moina irakpa mock epics in the zoo with heroic couplets in the yam business name. Kariyam kathay na mo. The world, according to classical poets, has a rigid structure. This meant enforcing morals and ethics in society that parallels strictly divine world order. Ona, we classicists in the rigid structure mui ko habidi order labor chaotic oidaba system ama labor rationalism labor. Neoclassical poetry objective, while romantic poetry is subjective. Neoclassical the objective oi habidi aigi mo magi mo ability ko neoclassical poetry de ulab ki achumba habida. Aduga romantic poetry is subjective way habidi angoda fasabi on the TBI, on the PAMBI, on the PAMBI. Romantics gave free and uninhibited expression of what they intuitively felt, expressed their own ideas and beliefs. Only ideas and share to week, have the Masamasagi, uniqueness of the Ubunga. Classical poets followed prescribed forms and beliefs as they felt they were universal for all, as is on the Mugidi, Anarama form, but they follow to change Kia Ubungam. I bet the experimentation there. Romanticism then ubupangi, classicism the ubupungbe or neoclassical poetry the ubunte. Classicists believe that everything, including nature and human nature, can be rationally apprehended, either understood by Nicole. Romanticists viewed nature as mysterious and ever-changing, and functioning of the universe cannot be rationally understood, and at best can be intuitively and imaginatively apprehended. Oh, no. Everything, nature or human nature or understand to be na classicists na hazi, romanticists na nature among human nature che yamna mysterious oi pa ya na rationally understood to ba sunya ya ro na moina thazai belief system tha that samat torjika. All English literature consists of sermons and sense lives, biblical translations, translated Latin works of the early church fathers, Anglo-Saxon chronicles and narrative history works, laws, wills, and other legal works, and practical works on grammar, medicine, geography, and poetry. Middle English. The Norman conquest of the 11th century, 1066, started Middle English period. The French, under the leadership of William the Conqueror, defeated English King Harold. The conquerors brought with them French culture and French language that influenced and enriched the native literature and culture. Elizabethan Age, known as Golden Age of English Literature. It could boast of great writers like Shakespeare, Marlowe, Spenser, and Johnson. Poetry and drama reached highest scale both in the quality and in number of plays and poems. History of England moves from the 16th to the 18th century, through the Elizabethan Age to the Commonwealth, to the Restoration Age, to the Augustan Age, through the reigns of Queen Elizabeth I, Charles I, Charles II, and Queen Anne. First half of 18th century, known as Age of Science and Reason. 18th century English literature described as Augustan Age, Age of Enlightenment, Neoclassical Age, Golden Age of Science and Reason, Age of the Novel, etc. Sina maming miyam dun ko 18th century gi akwai gi Age of kai na hayab ka Science and Reason to high, Age of Enlightenment to kowi, Neoclassical Age to high, Golden Age of Science and Reason to high. Maming yam grebo. England adopted mixed monarchy with two political parties fighting elections to rule nation, known as Whigs and Tories. Differences between classicism and romanticism. Classicism stresses on vision and romanticism on imagination. Diction in classical poetry is more rigid and measured, unlike in romantic poetry, which prefers simple diction of common people using their everyday idiom. The world, according to classical poets, has a rigid structure. This meant enforcing morals and ethics in society that parallels strictly divine world order. Neoclassical poetry objective, while romantic poetry subjective. Neoclassical poetry is objective way, romantic poetry in a subjective way. Romantics gave free and uninhibited expression of what they intuitively felt. Romantics in the power feel to openly share express their own ideas and beliefs. Classical poets followed prescribed form and beliefs as they felt they were universal for all ages. Brief history of English literature till the 18th century, so that you can now place Alexander Pope and the Rev of the Law in its proper context. English literature till the 18th century, Alexander Pope, the Rev of the Law, belief in reason, modern, sophisticated human nature, interest in idea of order, urban society, and human nature and formal correctness in conduct and behavior and unquestioning adherence to tradition and morals, love of satire and mock heroic writings, focus on realism and public themes and use of objectivity, make use of scholarly allusions such as literary, biblical, and religious allusions in their poetry to convey their message to their readers effectively and easily. 18th century poetry. The literary allusions are from poets like Homer, Virgil, and Horace. To inform and to entertain, to instruct and delight were the main purposes of their writing. So the classical writers example we have the Homer, Virgil, and Horace is inform to entertain to instruct to delight to. So that's all for today. Next lecture the unit number 2 Alexander Pope the Rev of the Law officially. So if any doubts come up in the next class, so I hope everyone has a good evening.